Imagine working alone in the dead of night, the world outside silent, the clock ticking slowly, and every creak or shadow making your heart race. Most people think the night shift is just about fighting off boredom and sleep, but for some it becomes a living nightmare. From gas stations to hospitals, from empty factories to deserted motels, the darkness hides more than we can ever imagine. These aren't just stories. They're disturbing true accounts of people who worked through the night and came to face with horrors they will never forget. The night shift has always carried with it an eerie reputation, often called the graveyard shift for good reason. While the world outside rests in darkness, those who work through the night live in a parallel reality where silence is louder than any noise, and shadows seem to breathe with a life of their own. Chapter 1 opens in this unsettling atmosphere, drawing attention to how the late hours change everything. What feels familiar and harmless during the day transforms into something unsettling at night. The same hallways, the same streets, and the same workplaces seem to hold a different weight, as though the absence of daylight reveals something that doesn't belong. For those who have experienced it, the graveyard silence is more than just quiet. It is suffocating, pressing down until even the sound of your own footsteps feels invasive. In this chapter, the world of night shift workers is unveiled, not with dramatic ghosts or monsters right away, but with the ordinary strangeness that begins to creep in when the rest of society is asleep. Imagine sitting in a brightly lit gas station, the fluorescent hum of the overhead lights filling the emptiness while outside the windows the parking lot sits deserted, stretching into blackness. A single car passes now and then, headlights cutting through the void, but quickly vanishing, leaving behind a stillness so complete it feels unnatural. For someone who works nights, this is the constant reality. Hours of nothingness, interrupted only by occasional movements that never feel entirely normal, because in the silence, even small disturbances take on a larger, more threatening shape. People often underestimate how the human mind reacts to this environment. When your body is wired to rest, but your job demands you stay awake, the mind begins to play tricks. You catch yourself staring at corners, convinced you saw something move. The sound of the building settling suddenly feels like footsteps. The buzz of a flickering light makes your skin crawl, as if someone is whispering your name. The longer the night drags on, the heavier the silence becomes, and soon it doesn't feel like you are alone, even if you know you are. The atmosphere itself becomes a character, haunting in its stillness, bending your sense of reality until fear feels completely rational. The chapter also focuses on the psychological toll of being awake when the rest of the world is sleeping. In the daytime, people rely on a sense of shared presence, neighbors mowing their lawns, traffic humming through the streets, voices filling the air. At night, that shared presence disappears. Workers find themselves cut off from the normal rhythm of life, trapped in a liminal space where time feels endless and distorted. A few minutes can feel like an hour. The simple act of walking down an empty hallway becomes a test of courage. You question every sound, every shadow, every moment of quiet. It's in these hours that paranoia begins to seep in, and with paranoia comes a sense that the world you thought you knew has been replaced by something far more sinister. To truly understand this experience, one must think of the body's natural fear of isolation. The graveyard silence amplifies this fear, because silence does not only represent peace, it also represents the absence of safety. When no one is around to hear you, no one is around to help you. The worker in a deserted building knows that if something were to go wrong, their screams would be swallowed by the night. This thought alone is enough to make the pulse quicken, to make hands tremble as they hold a flashlight, to make even the strongest individuals admit that being awake at 3 in the morning feels like standing at the edge of something otherworldly. The chapter paints vivid examples of ordinary workers, describing how the graveyard silence affects them. A nurse recalls how hospital hallways, filled with noise and bustle during the day, turn into endless tunnels of echoing footsteps at night. A security guard remembers how reviewing surveillance footage in the early hours made him feel like the cameras were watching him, instead of the other way around. A cashier at a 24-hour store admits how her stomach tightens when the automatic doors slide open and no one walks in. These stories highlight that the graveyard shift is never truly quiet. The silence hides countless layers of fear, imagination, and the unknown. What makes this silence so disturbing is that it never allows you to forget how vulnerable you are. In the darkness, surrounded by stillness, you realize that you are awake at a time when the world is supposed to sleep, and perhaps that is why strange things happen then. The night belongs to shadows, And those who work through it know that silence is never just silence. The gas station at night is a place of uneasy stillness, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that cast long shadows across the empty aisles and fuel pumps. The hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional creak of the old building fill the silence, but beyond that, the world outside is drowned in darkness. For the worker behind the counter, the night stretches endlessly, with only the faint sound of distant traffic breaking the monotony. Most nights pass in this strange limbo, uneventful but heavy with the weight of isolation, until the occasional customer drifts in. It is during these moments that the sense of vulnerability becomes most apparent, because in the dead of night, every stranger feels unpredictable. On one such night, a young attendant worked the late shift, fighting exhaustion while sipping coffee and restocking shelves. It was just past 2 in the morning when the automatic door slid open and a man stepped inside. At first, there was nothing remarkable about him. He wore a faded jacket and jeans, his hair messy as though he had been on the road too long. But something about his presence immediately unsettled the attendant. The way the man walked was slow, deliberate, as if he wasn't browsing but studying. His eyes lingered too long on the shelves, on the ceiling, and finally on the worker himself. It wasn't the normal glance of a customer. It felt like an assessment. The man wandered through the aisles without picking anything up, occasionally glancing over his shoulder, as though checking if he was being watched. The attendant tried to remain calm, forcing himself to look occupied by tidying the counter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the man's every movement was calculated. Minutes passed, though they felt longer, and still the man didn't approach the register. When he finally did, he placed a single bottle of water on the counter, his gaze fixed on the worker, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The small talk that most customers engage in never came. Instead, the silence between them seemed charged, and the attendant found himself gripping the edge of the counter a little too tightly. As the transaction ended, the man didn't leave immediately. He lingered by the door, turning his head slowly as if memorizing the layout of the store, the exits, the position of the cameras. The attendant's chest tightened with unease, and when the man finally walked out into the night, the relief was short-lived. He didn't drive away. Instead, he stood by the edge of the parking lot under the flickering light of a street lamp, staring back into the gas station. The worker's instincts screamed that something was wrong, and he locked the doors, trying to steady his breathing while keeping his eyes on the figure outside. Minutes turned into half an hour, and still the man remained, unmoving, watching. Every time the worker tried to distract himself, he would glance back and see the silhouette still waiting under the light. The oppressive silence of the graveyard shift now felt suffocating, and the worker could hear the rapid pounding of his own heart louder than the buzz of the lights overhead. He thought about calling the police, but what would he even say? That someone was standing outside staring. It wasn't a crime, but it felt like a threat nonetheless. Eventually, the man began pacing slowly across the parking lot, disappearing into the shadows, only to reappear moments later closer to the entrance. His movements grew erratic, as though he was testing the worker's reactions. The attendant stayed frozen behind the counter, the phone in his hand, debating whether to call for help. Every second dragged on like an eternity. Then, suddenly, the man pressed his face against the glass door, his hands cupped around his eyes as he peered inside. The worker stumbled back, his breath catching in his throat, as the man's smile widened in a way that felt inhuman. The moment stretched endlessly before the man finally stepped back, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he turned and walked into the darkness beyond the reach of the gas station lights. The worker waited, straining his eyes, but the figure never reappeared. The silence returned, but it wasn't the same as before. Now it carried a weight of dread, a reminder that the stranger had left by choice, not by force. The attendant didn't sleep for days after, replaying the encounter in his mind, wondering if the man had planned something worse, or if he might return on another quiet night, when no one else was around. Hospitals are unsettling enough during the day, but at night they transform into something entirely different. The busy hallways that once overflow with chatter, footsteps, and the sound of rolling carts fall into an unnatural quiet. Lights dim in certain wings, shadows stretch long across the tiled floors, and every sound echoes in ways that make the air feel heavy. For nurses working the night shift, this is the reality. The patients sleep, the visitors are gone, and the building itself seems to breathe in the silence. It was during one of these long, quiet nights that a nurse experienced something she could never explain. an encounter that would change the way she viewed those endless corridors forever. She was on her usual rounds, checking charts and making sure the patients were comfortable. The wing she was assigned to had fewer patients than most, which meant long stretches of walking down dimly lit hallways alone. As she pushed her cart down one such corridor, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. They were faint but unmistakable, the measured rhythm of shoes tapping against tile. She turned expecting to see another nurse, but the hallway behind her was completely empty. Shaking her head, she dismissed it as her imagination and continued on. Yet the sound returned, closer this time, stopping whenever she stopped. Her heart began to pound, and she reminded herself that old buildings made noises, that echoes could travel strangely in empty halls. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. She forced herself to finish her rounds, and as she turned the corner to check on a patient, she saw something that made her blood run cold. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure dressed in a hospital gown. The figure was still, facing away from her, its posture rigid. Her first thought was that a patient had wandered out of their room, which was dangerous, especially at night. She called out softly, telling the person to wait, but they didn't move. Slowly, she began walking toward them, pushing her cart cautiously. The closer she got, the more details she noticed. The gown looked faded and old, not the standard issue they used anymore. The figure's skin was pale, almost gray, and their hair hung down over their face, obscuring their features. She called out again, louder this time, but still there was no response. Just as she was within a few steps, the figure turned its head slightly, and though the hair still covered most of the face, she could see enough to know something wasn't right. The eyes were dark, too dark, like empty sockets staring into her. Before she could react, the figure turned and walked slowly down the hallway, its bare feet making no sound against the floor. The nurse froze in place, her body refusing to move. When she finally forced herself forward, she reached the corner the figure had disappeared around, only to find nothing. The hallway was empty, and every door was closed. There was no possible way anyone could have moved that quickly without making a sound. She stood there trembling, her breath shallow as she tried to convince herself that she had imagined it. But deep down, she knew what she had seen was real. Later that night, she confided in another nurse about what had happened. To her surprise, the other nurse didn't laugh or dismiss it. Instead, she nodded grimly and said she wasn't the first to see something in that wing. Others had reported figures wandering the halls, patients who weren't really there. Some claimed they were former patients who had died in the hospital, their restless spirits trapped in the place where their lives had ended. The nurse listened, her stomach twisting as the reality sank in. For the rest of her shift, every sound made her jump. The creak of the building settling, the hum of the lights, the distant beeping of machines. All of it felt amplified, as though reminding her that she was not alone. Even when she returned to her patients' rooms, she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every shadow seemed deeper, every corner more threatening. By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted not just from her duties, but from the constant fear gnawing at her. She never forgot that night or the figure in the hallway. It stayed with her, haunting her dreams and filling her waking hours with unease. Working in a hospital meant confronting sickness, suffering, and death, but she had never expected to confront something that couldn't be explained. From that moment on, the night shift was no longer just about caring for patients. It was about surviving the silence and whatever else might be waiting in the endless, dimly lit corridors. Factories at night hold a kind of emptiness that feels more alive than silence should ever feel. The machinery, usually roaring and rattling during the day, sits still like sleeping beasts, their massive forms outlined in dim emergency lighting. The air smells faintly of oil and metal, the kind of scent that clings to skin and clothes long after leaving. For the security guard tasked with watching over the building, it was supposed to be a simple job: walk the perimeter, check the locked doors, and monitor the cameras until morning. Yet as he began his shift that night, something about the atmosphere felt wrong, heavier, as though the cavernous space of the factory was holding its breath. The guard moved through his routine as always, flashlight in hand, boots echoing across the concrete floor. The sound of his steps reverberated back to him, creating the unnerving illusion that someone else was walking in rhythm just a few paces behind. He would pause, waiting for the echoes to die down, but each time he moved again, the sensation returned. At first, he told himself it was just the acoustics of the building. Large, empty spaces had a way of playing tricks on the ears. Still, He found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than usual, his light cutting into the darkness in quick, nervous sweeps. As he made his way past the rows of dormant machines, he thought he saw movement near one of the assembly lines. A shadow darting quickly out of sight, vanishing the moment his flashlight landed on the spot. His pulse quickened, and he convinced himself it was just his imagination. He kept walking, but the feeling that he was not alone became impossible to ignore. The deeper he went into the building, the more oppressive the silence became, broken only by the distant creaks and groans of the structure settling. Yet even those sounds began to feel intentional, like whispers echoing through the metal frames, growing louder the more he tried to dismiss them. Reaching the control room, he decided to check the security cameras. Rows of grainy monitors displayed different parts of the factory: storage rooms, corridors, loading docks. Most screens showed nothing but stillness, until one caught his attention. On the feed from the far end of the factory floor, a figure appeared between the machines. It stood perfectly still, indistinct in the poor quality of the camera, but clearly human-shaped. He leaned closer, his stomach tightening as the figure seemed to shift slightly, tilting its head in a way that suggested it knew it was being watched. He blinked, and suddenly the screen was empty again. The guard hesitated, torn between staying in the control room or investigating. His training told him to check it out, but his instincts screamed at him to remain where he was. Reluctantly, he grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the area he had seen on the monitor. The walk felt endless, the shadows between the machines swallowing the light before it could reach far ahead. Every few steps, he stopped, convinced he heard something moving just beyond his sight. The metallic clang of something falling echoed suddenly from the darkness, and his flashlight snapped in that direction. A wrench lay on the ground, though no one had been near it. Breathing hard, he forced himself to continue. When he finally reached the section from the camera, the space was empty. No footprints, no movement, nothing out of place except for the lingering chill that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He stood there, scanning the area, when a low sound drifted through the stillness. It was faint, almost like a whisper, carried through the pipes and ducts. He couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone or something was speaking. He backed away slowly, the beam of his flashlight trembling across the machines, desperate to find the source, but there was nothing there. On his way back, the uneasy sensation intensified. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward him. Every flicker of light felt deliberate. When he finally reached the control room again, he checked the monitors with shaking hands. His stomach dropped when he saw the figure once more, now standing directly in front of one of the cameras, its face obscured in static. For a brief moment, it almost looked like it was staring straight at him through the screen. Then the feed cut to black. The guard sat frozen, the silence pressing in from all sides. His flashlight, his only comfort, flickered weakly before stabilizing. He stayed there, gripping it tightly, unwilling to move or check the floor again. Somewhere deep in the building, something metallic clattered to the ground, echoing in the vast space, reminding him that whatever was sharing the factory with him was still there, and it was waiting. Hotels at night carry a strange duality. On one hand, they are filled with guests tucked safely behind locked doors, sleeping soundly after long days of travel. On the other, their endless hallways and dimly lit lobbies create an emptiness that feels hollow and unnatural. For the night receptionist working alone, the silence is broken only by the ticking of the clock and the occasional hum of the air conditioning. Hours can pass without seeing another person, and yet the sense of being watched is constant. It was during such a shift that an encounter unfolded which blurred the line between guest and something far more unsettling. The receptionist, a young man just a few weeks into the job, had already grown used to the monotony. He would scroll through the computer, tidy the counter, or sip coffee while staring at the glass doors that led to the deserted parking lot outside. Just past midnight, the automatic doors slid open with a faint chime, and a guest walked in. She was a woman in her late 30s, pale-skinned with dark hair that hung straight around her face. She carried no luggage, only a small purse clutched tightly to her chest. Something about her entrance felt off immediately. Most late, night arrivals came with suitcases or backpacks, but she seemed to have nothing at all. She approached the counter slowly, her eyes fixed on him without blinking. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but carried a strange flatness, as though rehearsed. She asked for a room, giving only her last name. The receptionist typed quickly, scanning the system, but her name didn't appear in the reservation list. When he explained this, she simply stared at him, then repeated her request in the same even tone, as if she hadn't heard a word. Unease crept over him, but he forced a polite smile and offered her a walk-in booking. She nodded once, never breaking eye contact, and signed the form with shaky handwriting that looked more like scribbles than letters. After handing her the key card, he watched as she walked toward the elevators. She didn't ask for directions, didn't glance at the numbers on the doors, and didn't seem to check the floor display inside the elevator. She simply pressed a button and disappeared behind the closing doors. Trying to shake the chill that lingered from the encounter, he returned to his tasks, convincing himself that tired travelers often acted strangely. An hour passed before he noticed something strange on the security monitors. The camera feed for the third floor showed the woman standing in the hallway outside her room. She wasn't moving, just standing there, her arms at her sides, her face turned toward the camera. At first, he thought she might be locked out, but when he zoomed in, his stomach dropped. The door behind her was open, the keycard still glowing green in the slot, yet she hadn't gone inside. She stood there for nearly 15 minutes without moving, her gaze locked on the lens as if she knew he was watching. Finally, she stepped backward into the room and closed the door. Relief washed over him, though uneasily. But when he checked the system again a few minutes later, he realized something was wrong. The room she had been assigned had already been occupied earlier in the day by another guest. He hadn't noticed the error in his tired state, but now the mistake gnawed at him. He quickly picked up the phone to call the room, but when he dialed, no one answered. He tried again, and this time the line filled with static, faint but unmistakable, followed by the sound of soft breathing on the other end. He hung up immediately, his pulse racing. Gathering his courage, he decided to go upstairs and sort out the situation. The elevator ride felt longer than ever, each floor crawling by with a metallic groan. When he stepped into the third floor hallway, it was silent, the kind of silence that feels like it's listening. He approached the door cautiously, his key ready in hand. Knocking softly, he called out, announcing himself. No answer. He tried again, louder this time, and the door creaked open slightly, though no one had touched it from the inside. He hesitated, peering into the dark room. The bed was neatly made, untouched, and the air smelled faintly of perfume, sharp and cloying. On the desk sat the keycard he had given her, but the room was empty. No suitcase, no purse, no sign that anyone had ever entered. He backed away slowly, his skin crawling, and returned to the lobby, trying to convince himself that fatigue was twisting his perception. But when he checked the monitors again, his breath caught. The woman was back on the third floor, standing in the hallway just as before, staring directly into the camera with that same expressionless face, as though she had never left at all. Libraries at night are places few people ever see. During the day, they are full of quiet activity. Footsteps tapping lightly on polished floors, voices hushed but present, pages turning with a rhythm that feels comforting. Once the doors close and the lights dim, however, that comfort vanishes. The shelves tower like endless walls, the silence grows so deep it presses against the ears, and the faintest sound carries as if the building itself is listening. For the librarian assigned to the late-night archival work, it was supposed to be an uneventful shift, just hours of sorting through returned books and updating the catalog before the next day began. But the building had its own plans, and the night revealed things that daylight kept hidden. She began her work with ease, rolling her cart between the aisles, the wheels squeaking faintly with every turn. The overhead lights cast a pale glow across the rows of shelves, leaving long shadows stretching into the distance. At first, she barely noticed the stillness, but as the hours passed, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the sound of her own movements. When she paused, the silence didn't feel empty, it felt crowded, as though something unseen was waiting for her to move again. Around midnight, she started hearing soft noises. At first, it was the sound of books shifting faintly on their shelves, as if brushed by a passing hand. She assumed it was the old building settling, or maybe the air conditioning creating vibrations. But then came the sound of footsteps, light, deliberate, echoing faintly through the stacks. She froze, clutching the cart's handle, listening. No one else was supposed to be in the library, not at this hour. Slowly, she pushed her cart forward again, forcing herself to believe it was just her imagination. But each time she stopped, the footsteps seemed to resume, keeping pace just a few rows away. Her heart raced as she decided to investigate. She walked cautiously down one of the aisles. The smell of paper and dust thickened the air. Her flashlight beam cut through the shadows as she searched for the source. When she reached the end of the row, she glanced left, then right. The aisles were empty. She let out a shaky breath, trying to laugh at herself, when suddenly, a book slid from the shelf beside her and landed on the floor with a sharp thud. She jumped back, her flashlight shaking in her hand. The book lay open, its pages fluttering though there was no draft. She bent down slowly to pick it up, but as her fingers brushed the cover, she noticed something that made her skin crawl. The title page was missing, ripped out cleanly, leaving only a jagged edge. Disturbed, she returned to her desk, leaving the cart behind. She tried to distract herself by logging the returned books into the system, but the computer screen flickered strangely, lines of text momentarily distorting before snapping back to normal. She blamed the old equipment, though unease crept deeper into her chest. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw a figure move past one of the tall windows, but when she looked directly, there was nothing. The library was supposed to be locked from the inside, impossible for anyone to enter unnoticed. A few minutes later, she glanced up at the security monitor above her desk. The grainy black and white feed showed the different sections of the library: reading rooms, stairwells, and aisles of books. At first, everything looked normal. Then her eyes caught on one camera, the one pointed at the very aisle where the book had fallen. A figure was standing there. Tall, unmoving, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood between the shelves facing the camera, though its face was blurred in the static. Her breath hitched, and she leaned closer, heart pounding in her ears. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, the aisle empty once again. She sat frozen, her hands gripping the desk, every instinct telling her to leave. Yet she remained afraid that moving might draw attention. The minutes dragged painfully, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the shelves. Finally, she heard it again, the unmistakable sound of pages turning, rapid and frantic, coming from somewhere deep within the stacks. Gathering what courage she could, she crept forward, her flashlight guiding her steps. The sound grew louder, echoing from a corner near the archives section. When she reached it, the noise stopped. A single book lay open on a table, its pages flipping wildly even though the air was still. The words on the page seemed distorted, the letters shifting before her eyes, twisting into shapes that made no sense. She backed away, trembling, and nearly dropped her flashlight when she caught sight of something reflected in the glass door of a nearby cabinet. Behind her, just for a moment, she saw the blurred outline of a figure standing in the shadows, watching her. When she spun around, there was nothing. The shelves loomed empty, silent once more, but the oppressive weight of being observed remained, pressing against her until she could hardly breathe. Parking garages after dark feel like places carved out of fear itself. Concrete walls echo every sound, and the dim fluorescent lights hum and flicker as if they are barely holding on. The air smells faintly of exhaust and dampness, and shadows stretch endlessly between the rows of empty spaces. For the woman working the late shift at a nearby office, the garage was the final step before freedom, an eerie walk to her car, the promise of home waiting at the end of a long day. Yet on this particular night, the garage was more than unsettling silence and dim light. It became the stage for something she would never forget. She left the building just past midnight, clutching her bag tightly as she stepped into the stillness of the garage. The sound of her heels striking the concrete floor echoed loudly, bouncing back at her in rhythmic patterns that felt too loud in the cavernous space. Normally, she parked close to the elevator, but that evening the lower levels had been nearly full, and her car sat tucked away in one of the far corners. The walk stretched longer than usual, each step amplifying the sense that she wasn't alone. Halfway to her car, she heard another set of footsteps. They were faint at first, almost blending with her own, but as she stopped abruptly, the sound continued for a beat before falling silent. Her chest tightened as she turned her head, scanning the rows of parked vehicles. Nothing moved. She whispered to herself that it was just the echo, nothing more, and forced her legs to carry her forward again. Yet with every few steps, the sound returned, slow, deliberate, always just behind her. Her pulse quickened, and she tightened her grip on her keys, holding them like a makeshift weapon. The air felt colder, heavier, as though someone was breathing in sync with her. She turned suddenly, her eyes darting between the cars, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw movement, a figure slipping between two parked sedans. But when she focused, the space was empty, nothing but shadows. She hurried her pace, the clicking of her heels echoing faster now, almost frantic. Finally, her car came into view. Relief washed over her for a moment, but it quickly dissolved when she realized the footsteps behind her had grown louder, closer. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat, and this time she was certain she wasn't imagining it. At the far end of the garage, partially obscured by a column, stood a tall figure. The dim light cast it in shadow, its face impossible to see, but its posture was unmistakably human. It didn't move. It only stood there watching. She fumbled with her keys, the metal jangling loudly in the stillness. Forcing herself not to run, she unlocked her car with shaky hands, all the while keeping her eyes fixed on the figure. Just as she pulled the handle and slipped into the driver's seat, the fluorescent lights above flickered violently, plunging the garage into near darkness for a few seconds. Her heart pounded as she jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as the lights steadied again. She glanced back toward the column, and the figure was gone. Her breathing came in shallow gasps as she threw the car into reverse. The tires squealed against the concrete, her headlights slicing through the gloom as she sped toward the exit ramp. But just as she rounded the corner, the beam of her headlights caught something that froze her blood. The figure was standing directly in the middle of the lane, facing her car. Its head tilted unnaturally to the side, its arms hanging stiffly at its sides. She slammed the brakes, her body jolting forward with the force. For a long, dreadful second, the figure didn't move, didn't react. It simply stood there, staring at her through the glass. Her hands trembled on the steering wheel, torn between honking the horn or flooring the accelerator. Before she could decide, the figure took one slow step forward, then another, the shadows clinging unnaturally to its body as it moved. Her instincts took over, and she pressed down on the gas, swerving violently to avoid hitting it. The car sped past, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror, but the space behind her was empty, the lane deserted as if nothing had ever been there. She didn't slow until she burst out of the garage and into the open night air, her chest heaving, her fingers aching from how tightly she clutched the wheel. Even then, the sense of being watched lingered, as though the shadows of the garage had followed her into the night, waiting for the next time she would walk alone through that echoing maze of concrete and silence. Hospitals after dark carry a silence that feels unnatural. The busy daytime rush of voices, footsteps, and constant movement disappears, leaving long corridors filled with dim light and an eerie stillness. Machines beep softly in the distance, carts creak faintly when moved, and the shadows in doorways seem to stretch further than they should. For the janitor assigned to the night shift, the hours dragged on in a haze of mopping floors and emptying trash bins. Yet one night, the silence grew heavier, and what began as routine work shifted into something that defied reason. He was on the 4th floor, the section of the hospital that housed long-term patients, though most of the rooms there were empty due to ongoing renovations. With his mop and bucket, he pushed slowly down the hallway, the squeak of the wheels echoing against the tile. At first, nothing seemed out of place, but then he noticed a faint sound drifting from one of the vacant rooms. It was soft, like a whisper, carried just above the hum of the fluorescent lights. He paused, straining to listen, and realized it was a woman's voice, speaking slowly, almost singing. Curiosity and unease pulled him toward the door. He leaned in, peering through the small window, but the room was dark and empty. When he opened the door and stepped inside, the voice stopped instantly. The only sound was the steady drip of a leaking faucet. The bed sat neatly made, untouched, and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic mixed with something older, like dust. Shaking his head, he returned to his cart, convincing himself that fatigue was making him hear things. But as he moved farther down the hall, the voice began again, this time from the opposite end, drifting from another empty room. His steps slowed, heart beating faster with every echo of that haunting melody. He decided not to check again, determined to finish his work and ignore the sound. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something strange. At the far end of the corridor, where the light bulbs often flickered, a figure stood. It was small, the silhouette of a woman in what looked like a hospital gown. She wasn't moving, just standing still, her head slightly tilted as though watching him. He froze, his grip tightening on the mop handle, but when he blinked, the hallway was empty. Trying to steady himself, he pushed the cart toward the elevator, deciding to move to another floor. But when the doors slid open, the reflection in the polished metal walls made his blood run cold. Behind him, just a few feet away, stood the same figure. He spun around, ready to confront it, but the hallway was bare. He stepped into the elevator quickly, pressing the button repeatedly, praying for the doors to close. As they did, he swore he heard faint laughter echo through the corridor. On the 3rd floor, he tried to calm down by focusing on his work. The wards there were quiet, patients asleep behind closed doors. As he cleaned near the nurse's station, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Expecting one of the nurses, he looked up, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, circling him though no one was visible. The lights flickered once, briefly casting the corridor in darkness, and when they steadied again, a shadow lingered against the wall. Longer than it should have been, stretching toward him though nothing was there to cast it. Fear gnawed at him, but he forced himself to finish, moving faster now. He tried to avoid looking down the hallways, but each time his eyes flicked that way, he caught glimpses of the figure, sometimes standing at the end of the corridor, sometimes visible through the small window of an empty room, sometimes reflected faintly in the polished floor tiles. She never moved quickly, never approached, but her presence was relentless, as though she was reminding him she was always there. When he finally returned his supplies to the closet, his body trembled from exhaustion and nerves. He closed the door firmly behind him, leaning against it to catch his breath. The silence was suffocating now, pressing in on all sides. Just as he began to steady himself, he heard it again. The soft voice, clearer this time, humming a tune he couldn't recognize. It was coming from right outside the door, as though the figure was waiting for him to step back into the hallway. Roadside diners are usually places of comfort, where weary travelers stop for a hot meal and a brief rest before continuing their journey. During the day, the smell of coffee fills the air, the clatter of dishes provides a constant rhythm, and conversations create a low hum that makes the place feel alive. At night, however, when business slows to a trickle, the atmosphere changes entirely. The lights glow harsh against the darkness outside, making the windows reflect more of the interior than the empty highways beyond. For the waitress working the overnight shift, the diner became both a sanctuary and a cage, a space where she was always exposed to whoever wandered in from the endless night. On one particularly quiet shift, the diner was nearly empty. Only one trucker sat in a booth near the back, sipping his coffee in silence while staring out the window. The clock above the register ticked slowly, and the neon sign outside buzzed faintly, its flicker spilling across the parking lot. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled, announcing a new arrival. A man stepped inside dressed in a faded jacket, his jeans dusty as though he had been walking for miles. He carried no bag, no wallet in hand, and his face was pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. What unsettled her most was the way he looked at her immediately upon entering, his gaze fixed and unblinking. He chose a booth near the window, sitting stiffly with his hands folded on the table. She approached with a polite smile, holding her notepad. When she asked what he would like, he responded slowly, his voice low and oddly monotone, requesting only a glass of water. Surprised, she nodded and brought it quickly, setting it down in front of him. He didn't touch it. Instead, he kept staring, his eyes locked on her in a way that made her skin crawl. Trying to shake off the unease, she returned to the counter, keeping her back turned as she busied herself with wiping the already clean surface. Minutes passed, and the man never moved. The trucker eventually finished his coffee, paid his bill, and left, giving her a nod on the way out. When the bell above the door jingled closed behind him, she realized with a sinking feeling that she was alone with the stranger. The silence thickened, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerators in the back. She turned her head slightly and saw that he was still sitting there, still staring, the glass of water untouched before him. She forced herself to approach again, asking softly if he needed anything else. He tilted his head slightly, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles, but he didn't speak. The silence stretched between them until she finally stepped back, heart racing. She picked up the phone behind the counter, pretending to check messages, but in truth she wanted to be ready to dial for help if necessary. When she looked up again, the booth was empty. The man was gone. Panic surged through her chest as she scanned the diner. But the door hadn't opened, the bell hadn't rung, and there was no sign of him leaving. Her breathing quickened as she walked toward the booth. The glass of water still sat there, beads of condensation sliding down its side. On the tabletop lay something she hadn't seen before, a small, torn photograph. She picked it up with trembling fingers and felt her stomach drop. The photo was faded, but it was clearly of her, taken years ago. She was younger, standing in her high school uniform, smiling with friends. She had no idea how this man could have had it. The sound of the doorbell jolted her, and she spun around, expecting to see him standing there again. But the door remained closed, the night outside still and empty. When she turned back, the photograph was gone, the booth bare except for the glass of water, Fear overwhelmed her, and she stepped back behind the counter, clutching the edge tightly as though it could anchor her. The shadows in the corners of the diner seemed to grow darker, pressing closer, and in the reflection of the window she thought she saw a shape moving behind her, though when she turned, there was only silence and the lingering sense that she was not alone. The final chapter unfolds in a quiet convenience store on the edge of a small town, a place that stayed open 24 hours for travelers, truckers, and late-night wanderers. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated the aisles, but outside the glass doors was only the vast emptiness of the night. The young cashier working the graveyard shift was used to solitude, hours filled with the repetitive rhythm of scanning items, stocking shelves, and staring at the clock that seemed to move slower as the night dragged on. She had heard stories from other night workers, whispers of strange encounters, things that lurked just beyond the reach of the light, but she always brushed them off as imagination running wild in the silence. That changed on one particular night when the stories became her reality. The first hour passed uneventfully, just the hum of the refrigerator units and the occasional car passing on the highway. Around 2 in the morning, however, she noticed something unusual. A car pulled into the lot but never parked properly. Instead, it idled near the edge of the lights, engine running, headlights off. She watched it through the glass, waiting for someone to step out, but the doors never opened. After several minutes, it slowly rolled backward and disappeared into the darkness of the road. Unease prickled at her skin, but she shook it off, telling herself it was nothing. Half an hour later, the bell above the entrance jingled. A man entered, tall and gaunt, his clothes slightly disheveled. He carried nothing in his hands, just walked slowly to the back of the store where the refrigerator stood. She greeted him, but he didn't answer. He opened a door, pulled out a single bottle of water, and walked silently toward the counter. His eyes never met hers. They were fixed just past her shoulder, as if watching something she couldn't see. When she scanned the bottle and told him the price, he simply placed exact change on the counter without a word, then walked back out into the night. The same car she had seen earlier rolled forward from the shadows, and he climbed inside. Together, they drove away without turning on their headlights. She tried to settle her nerves, but the stillness afterward felt wrong, heavy in a way she couldn't explain. The next customer didn't come through the door. Instead, she heard the sound of shuffling footsteps from the far aisle, as though someone had slipped in without triggering the bell. She looked up, but no one was there. The cameras behind the counter flickered, their grainy screens showing static before clearing. On one of them, she saw a figure standing in the snack aisle, motionless, its head bowed. She rushed to look, but the aisle was empty. When she turned back to the monitor, the figure was gone. Her pulse raced as she checked the doors, making sure they were locked. She was considering calling her manager when the lights above her flickered and dimmed, throwing the aisles into long, stretching shadows. From somewhere in the back, she heard the sound of cans tumbling to the floor, followed by a whisper that seemed to curl around her ears. It wasn't words she understood, but the tone was unmistakable. Mocking, taunting, almost daring her to investigate. Against her better judgment, she grabbed the flashlight beneath the counter and walked slowly toward the sound. When she reached the end of the aisle, the beam of her flashlight landed on something that made her freeze. On the floor sat a photograph, much like the one the waitress had found in the diner. She bent down slowly to pick it up, her hands trembling as she realized the picture was of her, taken recently outside the very convenience store where she now stood. She had no memory of anyone taking it. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she turned the photo over, and on the back, scrawled in jagged letters, was a single word: soon? As she dropped it and stumbled back, racing toward the counter. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone, but before she could dial, the security monitors flickered again. This time, every single screen showed the same thing. The figure closer now, its face obscured in shadow, standing directly in the center of the store. She looked up from the monitors and for the first time, she realized she was not alone. The lights cut out completely, plunging the store into darkness. Her scream caught in her throat as the sound of footsteps surrounded her, echoing from every direction. Then, just as suddenly, the lights blazed back on, and the store was empty. The aisles were silent, the photo gone, the monitors showing nothing but static. She was left alone, trembling behind the counter, the echo of those footsteps still burning in her ears. And with that, the story of the night shift reaches its end. Across gas stations, hospitals, parking garages, libraries, diners, And now this small convenience store, the truth becomes clear: the night is not as empty as it seems, and those who work within its silence often come face to face with things most people never will. Thank you so much for joining me on this chilling journey through 10 disturbing true night shift horror stories. If you enjoyed this experience, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Your support keeps these stories alive, and I can't wait to share the next nightmare with you. Stay safe, and remember, when the world sleeps, the night is always watching,